everyone, and welcome. I'm Jennifer, and you are listening to the Ego Next Door podcast. Today, we are going to discuss Stockholm Syndrome and psychological abuse. Colloquially known as Stockholm Syndrome, especially when describing high-profile cases in the media, Stockholm Syndrome is rarely defined in scientific literature, but essentially, it is a term used to describe the positive bond some kidnapped victims develop towards their captors. However, here we are going to discuss another type of Stockholm Syndrome, the one that a victim of psychological abuse develops towards their abusers, especially after long-term abuse. Generally speaking, being held hostage has always been associated with physical restraint or imprisonment. But there is another type of imprisonment that is much more difficult to pinpoint or detect, and in which the shackles persist and resist beyond location, purpose, motive, or time. I am talking about the prison of the mind. When looking at stress reactions that hostage and kidnapped survivors experience after regaining freedom, and at the odd sense of resignation, conformity, and eventually protection towards the captor or abuser, it is evident to recognize the parallels between victims of blunt and wrongful imprisonment and long-term psychological abuse. In a study by Speckhart et al., it was found that hostages held for 72 hours had already developed Stockholm Syndrome towards their captors, to the point where some even felt the need to visit their abusers in prison. In this practical kidnapping setting, victims end up developing positive bonds towards their abusers, a sort of gratitude for keeping them alive, although in power and control to simply end it. And remarkably enough, the fear they initially felt towards their captor pivots, making the victim feel fear, distress, and hostility against the authorities that were outside negotiating for their lives. Although this might seem like a wild example, it is food for thought. If 72 hours being captured and controlled to the point of fearing for one's life leads to this, imagine what can happen to someone who spent years under control in which their abuser shifts between moments of extreme horror, control, and violence to moments of breadcrumbing love and kindness. With such power and balance, one is bound to become confused and have difficulty making sense of the relationship, thus conforming out of fear and resignation. People often assume that being captive means being locked in a basement and unable to run away. But looking at the greater spectrum of things, we can see examples of this happening in a much more subtle way. This does not eliminate the validity of the situation. For example, if a child is born into an extremely controlling family. When you don't know what freedom is, you don't realize that you are being held captive. You might be able to physically step outside of your house, but if you keep being told repeatedly that you should not do it and getting grounded when you do, then chances are you are not going to want to attempt it very often. Some children end up being programmed to think this way. This is where things get even more complicated. The years that go by as a child becomes a grown-up with the capacity to be self-sufficient and or reach legal age are more than enough time for a caregiver to have obtained absolute control over a person's behaviors and routine. Survivors often experience a wide range of stress reactions that affect thinking, emotions, and interactions. Reactions associated with thinking include confusion, being overcautious and aware, denial, decreased concentration, intrusive thoughts, impaired memory, or fear of a highly abusive event happening again. Reactions associated with emotions include anxiety, anger, depression, guilt, shock, and a sense of helplessness. And reactions associated with interactions include often being on edge and the withdrawal and avoidance of family, friends, and activities. These reactions are frequently subconscious, and the victim is often unaware of the unhealthy patterns and defense mechanisms that they have developed. This can lead victims to end up developing an unhealthy bond towards the person that has caused them harm, to the point they will experience emotional distress upon separation from their abuser, or grief if their abuser is harmed. This is one of the reasons why victims often feel conflicted and struggle on a daily basis with a range of emotions and maladaptive interactions as they attempt to return to normality. In fact, they may also experience conflicting feelings of guilt for feeling emotionally bonded to someone who has caused them and others pain and abuse. Some authors recognize this pattern of reactions and symptoms as psychological kidnapping. This type of mind control is also common in cults, blackmailing, and grooming of victims. Victims' minds are corrupted in a way where their beliefs, preferences, desires, and even goals become erased and replaced by whatever is programmed by the abuser and into their minds. Some authors define psychological kidnapping as a process in which the perpetrator, seeking desired benefits and instrumental goals, develops an emotional bond with the victim. This bond causes the victim to gradually lower their defenses and risk perceptions, enabling the perpetrator to exploit the relationship for special considerations and assistance. The core of this process is often related to the Renquan dilemma, which deals with the tension between personal desires and social obligations, also known as reciprocity. Moreover, when being controlled, individuals often have to resort to coping strategies and adaptations. Previous events and testimonies of captivity survivors prove that hostages who decide to act positively towards their abusers gain negotiating power for small concessions. In the context of interpersonal relationships involving psychological abuse and mental captivity, it becomes easier to understand how abusers can manipulate victims into feeling a sense of loyalty towards them. However, being conditioned to mental captivity does not always originate in childhood. Sometimes, captivity comes at a later time or springs up from outside the family unit. For example, in high-control romantic relationships, peer pressure in friend groups, hostile work environments, academic settings, or in groups associated with governmental authority figures. Being radically manipulated by extreme group leaders or even manipulative people can be quite easy and can happen to anyone. Vulnerability to terror, the idea of love, and brainwashing does not choose gender, social or economic background, skin color, sexuality, age, or level of intellectuality. Although incomprehensible to those who have never experienced it, any human who has been through a defenseless or deeply hopeless experience in their life can become prey and can fall victim to psychological abuse. Xu et al. Described this by using the boiled frog syndrome. The premise is that if you put a frog in a pan of cold water and turn on the heat, the frog will happily sit there without noticing that the water is not only warm but is actually getting hotter and will result in death. The following quote from Xu et al. Describe this perfectly. The kidnapped would feel comfortable at the beginning by enjoying the favor and expressive care offered by the kidnapper without consciousness of the potential danger. But how does someone become a victim of psychological kidnap? How can someone lose control of their minds the one thing that is physically within control of someone's human experience. And more importantly, why does our brain allow us to develop a bond towards an abuser? Well, a lot of it has to do with adaptations to captivity stress. Scientists studied this in the past and found that during periods of forced captivity or coercive control, people often have no choice but to control their inner emotions and mirror their behaviors to their abuser's behaviors to stay safe. In other words, submitting to the perpetrator. Several researchers have attempted to describe the steps in which Stockholm effects develop, and although these results have differed, there are often major parallels. Many of these relationships begin with a heightened period of anxiety or shock, paired with resistance and compliance duality, followed by depression, disbelief, an ongoing state of hypervigilance, and finally, the gradual acceptance of one's situation, which results in adaptation and the adoption of several coping strategies. Due to the risk of attempting to negotiate terms and conditions with an abuser, victims often decide that the best-case scenario to survive is to practice self-restraint and internalize emotional outbursts. These are often the only risk-free way for a victim to remain safe in their situation of captivity. In terms of recovery, scientists have identified several stages that individuals often go through. These include brief euphoria, hyperarousal, compliance and resistance, denial, restitution, and finally, gradual readjustment. While these stages are typically associated with physical captivity, such as kidnapping or forced imprisonment, they can also parallel the behavioral reactions resulting from psychological captivity. To illustrate this, I will share personal examples that might help make these stages easier to comprehend. The initial phase of recovery is often marked by a brief period of excitement and elevated spirits, sometimes accompanied by an intoxicating sense of joy. However, this phase is generally short-lived. In cases of physical captivity, it might last only a few seconds to minutes. For psychological captivity, the timeline can be even more erratic. For example, after I escaped from my abusers, I felt genuinely really excited and pumped. I was so happy with the premise of finally being able to be myself and feeling like somehow I was going to get a second shot at life and being born again. However, this utter joy and feeling of ecstasy was short-lived as I felt myself entering the second stage, hyperarousal. This stage is characterized by a stark contrast to the lack of stimulation often experienced during captivity. Suddenly, the external environment can feel overwhelmingly stimulating, leaving the person feeling disoriented and mentally sluggish. In my case, I felt very overwhelmed with everything around me, the novelty of different surroundings, the mourning of the life I've had, and adaptation to a drama-free daily routine, where the nagging voices of discouragement and disapproval disappeared from my environment, yet lived on inside my head. This left me feeling very emotionally reactive and extremely overloaded and exhausted by everything around me. This stage appeared to sort of overlap with the next one, compliance resistance. This is where survivors oscillate between compliance with requests and resistance to group activities or tasks perceived as irrelevant to personal needs. This phase reflects a struggle to regain autonomy and can vary widely in duration and intensity. In this stage, I also felt an abrupt shift among a side of me that craved extreme independence and a side of me that felt extremely codependent and needy, as I noticed myself relying excessively on my partner and friends with internal struggles and insecurity. In my particular situation, I had no choice but to accommodate to a less than ideal situation of self-seclusion to ensure personal safety, as although running away, my abusers had made it clear that they would not ever simply let me go. The transition between this stage and the next one appeared even more overlapped as I entered denial and depression, feeling a deep part of myself putting aside the fact that all I had gone through was a big deal and called for time to rest and recover. In fact, the stage of denial is often characterized by it. Survivors might downplay or outright deny the harm caused by their captors, or they may even question whether any damage exists. This stage can be particularly complex in psychological captivity, where the lines of culpability and damage can be blurred. The restitution stage followed, marked by attempts to regain control and independence. During this time, individuals might experience issues with emotional regulation, withdraw to avoid overstimulation, or engage in other unhealthy coping mechanisms. This is often a tumultuous phase as they navigate their new reality. Personally, I found this phase to be one of the most difficult ones. I expected instant results and was angered by the difficulty in adapting. I refused to accept that patience is indeed a virtue and that I would need a long time of adopting new, healthier behavioral patterns before even being able to touch the surface of mindful living. Finally, the longest stage is gradual readjustment. This involves dealing with the long-term psychological scarring and, in some cases, premature physical ailments. Post-traumatic stress symptoms are common, and this process of readjustment can last months, years, or even a lifetime as individuals work to rebuild their lives, heal, and set themselves free from the damage. On the next episode, we will discuss trauma bonds and attachment styles in the dating world. Thank you for listening to the Ego Next Door podcast. See you soon, and I hope you have a wonderful day. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to hear more, don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Ego Next Door. And if you would like to support my work, consider becoming a patron on my Patreon creator page at Jennifer Hachia. The Ego Next Door podcast is presented solely for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The content here is not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, or medical treatment of a qualified healthcare provider. Reliance on any information provided here is at your own risk. If you or someone you know is in crisis or experiencing suicidal thoughts, please reach out immediately to someone who can help right away. Call your national emergency services or go to the nearest hospital.